It begins with silence, not the peaceful kind you find on a quiet night in the suburbs, but the heavy, uneasy silence that presses down on a city used to chaos. New York, 1936. For years, the streets had echoed with the sounds of deals struck in whispers, of footsteps echoing through alleys where money changed hands, and of the kind of laughter that only comes when you believe you own the night. And at the center of it all was one man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a visionary. To all, he was power. But power, as he always knew, had a habit of shifting when you least expected it. And now, behind the cold bars of Sing Sing, Lucky found himself stripped of the freedom that once made him untouchable. The papers called it justice. They splashed his face across front pages, labeling him the mastermind of vice, the architect of corruption, the king of the underworld finally brought to heel. The trial had been a spectacle, the kind America loved in those years when the Great Depression had hardened people's hunger for drama. Here was a man who had dined with senators and movie stars, who had built empires out of rackets and gambling dens, now reduced to a defendant in a suit, standing silent while prosecutors painted him as the face of moral decay. For the public, it was a cleansing. For Lucky, it was theater. He sat through the accusations with a half-smile, the same smirk that once made friends feel safe and enemies feel small. Inside, though, he wasn't smiling. That night, as the cell door clanged shut, Luciano ran his fingers along the cold concrete wall. He was 40 years old, but prison aged a man fast. The ceiling felt lower, the air thicker. Gone were the velvet booths of the Waldorf Astoria, the warm glow of chandeliers above him, the scent of fine cigars curling in expensive rooms. In their place was the sour stench of iron and sweat, the distant coughs of men who had long since accepted their fate. But Lucky wasn't one of them. He wasn't built for surrender. The way he saw it, a cell could hold his body but not his crown. The guards watched him carefully. Some saw him as just another inmate, a number on paper. Others, though, recognized him. They knew that the man sitting quietly in the corner had once controlled the lifeblood of New York. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Even in silence, he carried the weight of authority. And that unsettled them. How could a prisoner, stripped of wealth, stripped of freedom, still seem like a king? But that was Lucky's gift, presence. The kind of presence that made men loyal and made enemies careful. As he lay on the thin mattress, listening to the restless hum of the prison around him, memories rose like smoke, the Lower East Side when he was just another immigrant kid hustling to survive, the nights spent running dice games, the scraps in alleyways, the scars on his face from knife fights that nearly ended him before he began. They had called him lucky because he survived what should have killed him. But Luciano never believed it was luck. It was calculation. Always calculation. And calculation didn't end because a judge said so. New York itself seemed different without him. The whispers from outside told him of shifting power, lieutenants scrambling to hold on to pieces of the empire, rivals circling like vultures. To the world, Luciano was finished, a trophy for prosecutors. But Lucky understood something they didn't: power wasn't in the streets or the bars or the casinos. Power was in loyalty. And loyalty didn't die at the slam of a cell door. At night, when the prison fell into uneasy sleep, Luciano imagined the city. He could almost see it, the neon signs flickering on 42nd Street, the smoke-filled backrooms where deals were still being made, the women laughing in nightclubs where his name was still whispered with reverence or fear. He imagined his men still out there, some loyal, some tempted to betray. And he knew that as long as his name lingered in those rooms, he wasn't finished. He was simply waiting. The prison walls had their own rhythm. Mornings were loud with clanging metal, the shuffle of boots, the barked orders of guards. Days stretched on endlessly, broken only by the mealtime rituals and the occasional fight echoing down the corridors. Yet within that monotony, Luciano found a strange clarity. Stripped of distractions, a man was forced to face himself. He thought about the choices that brought him here, the alliances he had built, the enemies he had made. He thought about Maranzano, about Masuria, about the blood spilled to bring the mafia into a new order, his order. An empire designed not for chaos but for structure. The commission had been his greatest invention, a way to bring order to an underworld that had once devoured itself. And now that order faced its greatest test. Still, prison had its dangers. Inmates eyed him with suspicion. Some wanted to test themselves against the man the newspapers called the boss of bosses. Others wanted to win his favor. Luciano moved carefully, choosing when to speak, when to stay silent. He understood that in here, as out there, survival depended on reading the room. He made no rash moves. He let his reputation do most of the work. If a man tried to provoke him, Lucky's stare alone was often enough to cool the fire. The irony wasn't lost on him. Outside, he had built an empire on noise, the noise of deals, of guns, of money changing hands. Inside, survival came from silence. From knowing when not to speak, when not to act. In some ways, it was a new kind of power. A quieter one, but no less sharp. He was learning to master it. As weeks bled into months, Luciano began to realize that prison wasn't just punishment. It was transformation. The system thought it had clipped his wings. But in truth, it had forced him to sharpen his mind, to refine his patience. He was no longer a man rushing from deal to deal, putting out fires, juggling the demands of lieutenants and politicians. Now he was something different, a strategist, waiting for the right moment. Outside, the city carried on. People whispered that Lucky Luciano was done, his empire splintering, his rivals ascending. But Luciano, sitting on his bunk, knew better. History was full of kings dethroned, only to return stronger. He had no intention of being remembered as a relic. The streets had gone quiet the day he was locked away. But silence, as he was learning, wasn't the absence of power. Silence was its preparation. And so, as the lights dimmed in Sing Sing and the echoes of footsteps faded into the night, Lucky Luciano closed his eyes. Not in defeat. Not in surrender. But in calculation. The king was in chains, yes. But chains, after all, could be broken. The first nights are always the hardest. That's what old-timers used to say when they spoke about prison. For most men, the shock of losing freedom cut deeper than any blade on the streets. The clang of steel doors, the shouts bouncing off concrete, the smell of too many men crammed into too small a place, it broke them fast. But for Lucky Luciano, the nights weren't just hard, they were haunted. The walls around him weren't only stone and iron, they were mirrors reflecting back the world he once commanded. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling that pressed down heavier than the weight of his sentence. His hands, once used to silk sheets and tailored suits, now brushed against rough wool blankets and cold springs. Yet in his mind, he was still walking the polished halls of the Waldorf Astoria. He could see the golden chandeliers, hear the hum of power and the laughter of politicians and businessmen who owed him favors. Even behind bars, he could smell the faint trace of expensive cigars, the kind smoked only by men who knew they could buy silence. Those memories weren't comfort. They were reminders of what had been taken, of what waited outside. Every morning, the guards rattled the doors, their boots echoing like gunshots in the corridor. Luciano would rise slowly, never showing impatience, never letting them see weakness. That was part of the game. Even in chains, you carried yourself like a boss. Some of the other prisoners shuffled nervously to the chow line, their eyes on the floor. Lucky never did. He walked with his chin high, calm, almost regal, as if the prison itself were just another club he happened to own. That presence bought him distance. In a place where respect was the only currency, Luciano still had plenty of it. But presence alone couldn't drown out the past. The cell was too small to contain his memories. At night, when the prison quieted down, they came flooding back, nights with Meyer Lansky plotting the future over whiskey, days when Frank Costello smoothed deals with politicians, the grin on Bugsy Siegel's face when another casino racket went their way. Those were velvet memories, lush and intoxicating, a world away from concrete walls and the sour stench of sweat. He replayed those scenes like a film, reminding himself who he was, reminding himself that a cell didn't erase an empire. The trial itself lingered in his thoughts, the photographs, the prosecutors parading witnesses like trophies, the papers calling him the mastermind of prostitution in New York. He had sat through it calm, smirking even, but inside he burned. He knew it wasn't justice. It was theater. Thomas Dewey, the ambitious prosecutor, wanted a headline, wanted a career built on Lucky's downfall. And he got it. Luciano had been made into a symbol, the immigrant gangster brought low by American law. But Lucky knew symbols outlast sentences. If Dewey thought a prison cell meant silence, he didn't understand the kind of loyalty Luciano commanded. The guards spoke about him in whispers. Some feared him, others wanted to see if the stories were true. A few tried to treat him like any other inmate, but even then there was hesitation in their voices. Luciano noticed everything, the way they glanced at him longer than at other men, the way conversations hushed when he walked past. They might have had the keys, but they knew deep down they were standing near a man who had once held a city in his hands. And if the day came that he walked free, he might hold it again. Inside, Luciano kept to a careful rhythm. He ate slowly, never rushing, as if meals were still served in fine restaurants. He spoke sparingly, never wasting words, but when he did, men listened. Inmates who once thought of testing him quickly reconsidered. He didn't need fists or knives. His reputation walked into every room before he did. Still, he kept his guard up. In prison, envy was a poison, and there were always those who wanted to make their name by cutting down a king. Luciano wasn't afraid, but he wasn't careless either. At times, though, solitude crept in. He would lie awake, staring into the dark, hearing the muffled snores and coughs of men around him, and feel the sharp edge of loneliness. Out there, in the world he'd built, he was never alone. There were always people, friends, allies, women, soldiers, orbiting his gravity. Now the silence pressed in close, and he had only his own thoughts for company. He hated it, but he also understood it. Solitude was sharpening him. It was forcing him to see the lines he had crossed, the enemies he had made, and the future he still intended to claim. What struck him most in those early months was the contrast. By day, he was trapped in monotony, roll call, meals, work detail, the endless rhythm of confinement. By night, in his memories, he was freed, gliding through nightclubs, brushing shoulders with stars, commanding a room with a glance. The velvet memories clashed against the concrete walls, each reminding him of the other. Without the prison, he might never have realized just how high he had climbed. Without the memories, the prison might have swallowed him whole. Every gangster knows two truths: nothing lasts forever, and silence can be deadly. Luciano embraced both. He didn't rage against the bars. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he let the silence harden him, let the memories remind him of what still waited. This wasn't an ending. It was a pause. A dangerous, simmering pause. As weeks passed, Luciano began to notice how other inmates gravitated toward him, some out of fear, some out of curiosity, some out of a desire to touch a piece of his legend. He spoke little, but when he did, it carried weight. He gave advice sparingly, a word here, a look there. He never overplayed his hand. That was the secret. Even locked away, he was teaching by example, calm, control, and patience. Men began to see him not as a prisoner but as a presence that made the prison itself feel smaller. And in those moments, lying back on his bunk, eyes half closed, drifting between the concrete present and the velvet past, Luciano knew one thing with certainty: walls could not erase memory, and silence could not kill power. The city outside might have forgotten for a while, but it would remember. It always did. Respect. In the outside world, it was bought with money, earned with power, and sealed with blood. Inside prison, respect was stripped down to its rawest form. A man could be rich on the streets, feared in neighborhoods, worshipped in clubs, but in here, none of that mattered if he couldn't command respect in the yard. And Lucky Luciano knew this better than anyone. The name might carry weight, but weight could crumble if it wasn't held steady every single day. The first weeks were a test. The guards had their rules, written in ink, barked out like orders from above. But the inmates lived by another set, one unwritten, older, sharper, the code. Everyone knew it, and everyone who broke it paid a price. Don't snitch. Don't take what isn't yours unless you're ready to fight for it. Don't show weakness. Don't disrespect another man unless you're willing to bleed. And above all, know your place. That was the law behind bars, the law that mattered more than anything written in the books of Albany or Washington. Luciano didn't come in blind. He had survived too much on the streets to underestimate what awaited him inside. He didn't swagger into the mess hall like a man expecting deference, nor did he slink in like someone broken. He walked the line in between, calm, measured, observing. He knew the first impression would decide everything. And it did. There were men from every corner of New York packed into Sing Sing: Italians, Irish, Jews, blacks, Puerto Ricans. Each group carved out its own space in the prison, its own hierarchy. For the Italians, Luciano was a strange kind of figure. Some saw him as a legend, a hero of their blood. Others saw him as a target, a chance to take a swing at the so-called king. And then there were the ones who didn't care who he had been out there, because in here, everyone was just another body in gray. It didn't take long for tests to come. They always came. A bump in the chow line. A stare too long in the yard. A whispered challenge passed from cell to cell. But Luciano didn't react with fists or rage. He reacted with eyes. Cold, steady, unblinking. The kind of look that reminded men that this wasn't some neighborhood tough they were dealing with, this was Lucky. A man who had outlived Masuria and Maranzano. A man who had seen more blood spilled in backrooms and alleys than most of these inmates could imagine. His silence was louder than a shout. His calm was sharper than a blade. Slowly, the challenges stopped. Not because men feared a fight, but because they realized the fight wouldn't end with them. Luciano carried shadows with him, even here. But respect wasn't built on fear alone. Luciano understood that. Fear could keep a man at a distance, but loyalty pulled him closer. And in prison, loyalty was worth more than cigarettes or stolen bread. Luciano began to build quiet bridges, a favor here, a nod there. He used his connections, the guards who could be persuaded with cash sent from the outside, the inmates who knew his people, the smuggling networks that slipped contraband through the cracks of the system. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't boast. He simply made life smoother for those who mattered, and in return, he earned their quiet allegiance. The guards noticed, of course. They always did. Some resented it. How could a prisoner, even one like Luciano, command more respect than they did? But others leaned into it. A smuggled pack of quality tobacco, a softer word in the work detail, a cell assignment that conveniently kept him away from certain enemies, it all added up. Corruption wasn't new to Sing Sing. It was part of its foundation. And Luciano, master of turning flaws into opportunities, played it like a violin. Yet even with favors and alliances, danger never disappeared. Rival gangs inside the prison eyed him carefully. The Irish held sway in some blocks, the blacks and Puerto Ricans in others. Tensions could flare without warning. A card game gone wrong, a piece of bread stolen, a slur tossed in anger, small sparks that could turn into riots. Luciano stayed clear of petty squabbles. He knew better than to get dragged into fights that meant nothing. But he also knew when to make a stand. Once, when a younger Italian inmate was cornered by Irish toughs, Luciano stepped in. He didn't swing, didn't shout. He simply walked between them, his presence alone enough to make the Irish back down. That moment spread like wildfire. Luciano wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting his people. And so a kind of balance formed. The Italians looked to him, the guards respected him, and rivals kept their distance. But Luciano knew balance was fragile. Every day was another test, another calculation. One wrong move and it could all crumble. At night, in his cell, he thought about the code. On the streets, he had built the commission, the mafia's council to enforce order. He had lived by omerta, the code of silence. Now, in prison, the code was different but familiar. Don't talk. Don't betray. Don't break. It was the same principle in a different uniform, survival. The men around him began to shift. Some treated him as a mentor, asking for advice on how to handle debts, fights, rivalries. Luciano gave guidance sparingly, never overplaying his hand. But every word he spoke carried weight. He had become something different here, not just a boss, but a teacher of sorts. And that role suited him. It was power of another kind, of quieter, but no less real. Months passed. The rhythm of prison life became routine, yet beneath the surface, Luciano was weaving threads. He was creating a network inside, mirroring the one he had built outside. Guards, inmates, allies, all tied together not by contracts or titles, but by favors and respect. That was the code behind bars. You didn't survive by being the loudest or the strongest. You survived by knowing when to act, when to hold back, and who to stand beside when the time came. Luciano lay on his bunk one night, the glow of the corridor light slanting through the bars, and realized something: the prison hadn't broken him. It had sharpened him. On the streets, power was noisy: gunshots, engines, laughter, sirens. In here, power was silent. A look. A word. A favor. And maybe, just maybe, that silence would prove more dangerous than the noise ever had. They thought the bars would muzzle him. They thought the clang of the gates, the endless routine of prison, the constant watch of guards would strip him of his voice. But they misunderstood what power really was. Power wasn't always in shouting orders or pulling triggers. Sometimes the most dangerous power was the kind that spoke in silence, the kind that traveled farther than any sound could reach. Inside Sing Sing, Luciano barely spoke about business. To most ears, he was just another inmate moving through the rhythm of the day: roll call, meals, the yard, the cell. But beneath that surface, there were currents no one could see. Letters slipped quietly through cracks, coded phrases stitched into harmless sentences, words carried by men who knew how to keep their mouths shut. He didn't need to raise his voice. His influence whispered its way past the bars, reaching streets where his name was still law. The system tried to keep him cut off. Letters were monitored, visits were restricted, conversations were watched. But this was America in the 1930s, and where there was money, there was a way. Guards, clerks, even lawyers could be persuaded with folded bills or the promise of future favors. Lucky had been playing that game all his life. Now he simply played it from a different board. On the outside, the mafia didn't vanish. It adapted. Luciano had built the commission for this very reason, so no one man's fall would bring the whole empire crashing down. His lieutenants still gathered in backrooms, still divided territories, still ran rackets from Harlem to Brooklyn. And though he was miles away, locked in a cell, his shadow stretched across every meeting. His opinion, delivered through coded notes or whispered through trusted messengers, still carried weight. The newspapers claimed his reign was over. Prosecutors boasted that the kingpin was finished, rotting behind bars. But the streets told a different story. Bookies, pimps, gamblers, and loan sharks still spoke his name. Politicians who once took his call still waited nervously to see if he might resurface. Rivals hesitated, never fully convinced that the man in prison wasn't still pulling strings. That hesitation was power. That doubt was control. Within Sing Sing, Luciano carried himself the same way. He wasn't loud, wasn't brash. He didn't need to be. His calm unsettled people. Guards expected anger, inmates expected bluster. Instead, they got Silent's eyes that seemed to see more than they should, a man who moved as if nothing here could truly touch him. That calm spread like smoke. Other Italians in the prison felt stronger just knowing he was there. Rivals thought twice before provoking him. Even guards, men with the keys, sometimes found themselves lowering their voices when they stood near his cell. It wasn't just intimidation. It was the aura of control. Luciano had mastered it long ago, the art of never letting others see you sweat, never letting the world know where you were weak. In prison, that art became his armor. The less he said, the more people imagined. And imagination, he knew, could be more dangerous than any blade. At night, when the prison settled into uneasy quiet, Luciano sat on his bunk and thought about the nature of power. He had spent years building an empire of noise, the clinking of glasses in nightclubs, the sound of cash changing hands, the echoes of gunfire in alleys. But here, behind these walls, he discovered another form of it. Silent power. Influence that required no sound, no display. Just the weight of a name, the certainty of loyalty, and the patience to let fear and respect do the work. Still, it wasn't without risk. The authorities were watching. Hoover's FBI, state prosecutors, ambitious politicians, they wanted to make sure Lucky's voice never reached the streets again. Informants were planted. Letters were intercepted. Visitors were questioned. But even under that scrutiny, messages slipped through. Sometimes they were disguised as letters from family, sometimes buried in legal jargon, sometimes passed hand to hand by men who owed Lucky favors stretching back years. Each note was a thread connecting him to the outside world, weaving his silence into influence. Among the inmates, this aura grew. Some whispered that Luciano had deals with the guards, that he had eyes and ears everywhere. Others swore he had ways of getting word out faster than anyone else. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The belief was enough. In prison, rumor was currency. And Lucky's legend fed on rumor like a fire fed on oxygen. The silence gave him space to think, too. To watch. To calculate. He studied the guards, their routines, their weaknesses. He noted which inmates allied together, which ones simmered with resentment, which ones were clever enough to be useful. Every detail mattered. A man didn't stay on top by luck, despite what his name suggested. He stayed there by observing what others missed. Luciano began to see his imprisonment less as a sentence and more as a stage. Out there in the city, his lieutenants carried his orders. In here, he played a subtler game. Every nod, every quiet word, every small act of generosity was a move. He wasn't building an empire this time. He was maintaining one. And maintaining, he realized, required patience, the kind of patience that could outlast steel bars and concrete walls. Years later, men would argue about how much influence Luciano really had from behind bars. Some claimed he was running the mafia from his cell. Others insisted he was powerless, cut off from the streets. The truth lay somewhere in between. He wasn't giving daily orders, wasn't micromanaging every racket. But his presence, his silence, his very existence as a symbol that was enough to steady the men who still swore loyalty to him. And sometimes a symbol was more powerful than any command. As dawn broke over the Hudson and the sun cut thin beams through the barred windows, Luciano sat quietly in his cell. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another inmate lost in thought. But behind that calm exterior, strategies were unfolding, loyalties were being measured, and silent power was being sharpened like a blade. He knew the prosecutors believed they had silenced him. But what they didn't understand was simple: silence wasn't the absence of power. Silence was its weapon. The walls of Sing Sing were supposed to keep sound trapped, to choke off voices and bury secrets in cold stone. But walls never kept whispers from traveling. In a place like this, Whispers were currency, whispers were survival. And for lucky Luciano, whispers were still power. It began with the smallest things. A word slipped during chow. A nod exchanged in the yard. A scrap of paper folded so small it could be hidden inside a shoe sole. Inmates had their ways of passing information, ways older than the prison itself. And Luciano, with his patient eyes and calm voice, stepped into that rhythm like he'd been born to it. He didn't ask for favors directly. He didn't boast about connections. He simply became the man people trusted with a word too dangerous to say out loud. Prison was a city inside stone walls. It had its markets, its hierarchies, its politics. There were the gangs, Italians, Irish, African Americans, Latinos, each carving out their corners. There were the hustlers who smuggled cigarettes, the men who ran dice games in the shadows, the lookouts who made sure the guards turned their heads at the right moments. Everyone survived by trading something. And what Luciano traded wasn't contraband. It was certainty. If he said something would be done, it was done. If he gave his word, it held. Even locked up, his name carried a weight few others could match. The whispers reached beyond the prison too. At first, it was through lawyers, coded notes stitched into legal phrases, slipped across tables under the pretense of signatures. Then it was through guards, men who had debts on the outside or simply wanted a few dollars more in their pockets. A message slipped out through one, another through two. Soon, Lucky didn't even have to ask. The network formed itself, built by men eager to bask in his shadow. But every whisper was dangerous. The state wanted him cut off. They monitored letters, scanned visitors, even tried to rotate guards to prevent relationships from forming. Hoover himself was said to have sent men to investigate whether Luciano's reach still stretched beyond the prison. And yet, no matter how hard they tried, messages still slipped through. Like smoke through cracks, like water through stone, they found their way out. On the outside, whispers became decisions. A nightclub deal in Manhattan held steady because the men involved swore Luciano's blessing had reached them. A numbers racket in Harlem shifted leadership after a coded message suggested who should take charge. Even a conflict brewing in Brooklyn cooled when word spread, no one knew exactly how, that Lucky wanted peace, not blood. Whether the whispers were real or imagined, they shaped the streets. And that was the brilliance of it. Inside Sing Sing, the whispers shaped the prison itself. Inmates argued about whether Luciano had pulled with the warden, whether guards slipped him information, whether he was untouchable. Some swore he had money flowing inside, buying comforts others couldn't dream of. Others claimed he had people on the outside protecting his family, ensuring his empire stayed intact. Whether the details were true hardly mattered. What mattered was belief. Belief turned into loyalty, and loyalty turned into silence when questions came from the wrong mouths. Luciano understood the power of rumor better than anyone. He let it spread, never confirming, never denying. Sometimes he'd drop a word that seemed casual, then watch as it twisted through the prison grapevine, reshaped, exaggerated, magnified. A single phrase could become a legend by the end of the week. And legends, he knew, were often more useful than facts. At night, when the prison sank into its uneasy quiet, Luciano would lie on his bunk and listen. Not to voices in the hall, though they were always there, but to the idea of sound itself. Every whisper carried farther than it should. Every muttered word echoed through stone. And in those echoes, he found his weapon. He didn't need to shout commands. He only needed to seed whispers, let them grow, let them move from cell to cell until they became truth in the minds of others. But whispers also carried danger. Not everyone in Sing Sing admired him. There were men who resented his calm, who wanted to test the legend, who thought taking a swing at Luciano might raise their own name. Some whispered in darker corners, plotting ways to undermine him, to expose the networks he'd built. Luciano handled them the way he handled everything else, quietly. A favor here, a reminder there, a sudden transfer for a man who had made too much noise. Problems didn't erupt into violence. they dissolved into silence. That was his way. On the streets outside, the whispers reached new ears. Journalists began speculating that Luciano was still the invisible hand guiding organized crime. Politicians demanded investigations, while lawmen whispered among themselves that it was impossible for a man so deeply embedded in the underworld to be truly cut off. These whispers fed the myth, and the myth fed Luciano's survival. He didn't have to prove he was still in control. The fear that he might be was enough. Among his closest allies, whispers became lifelines. Men like Meyer Lansky knew how to read between lines, how to pull orders from fragments, how to act without ever needing explicit words. They were masters of silence too. A single coded phrase could move thousands of dollars, silence a rival, or open a new racket. The whispers between them built an empire invisible to lawmen but tangible to everyone else who tried to cross their path. In Sing Sing, some nights stretched endlessly, the silence broken only by distant footsteps or the clank of metal. But for Luciano, those nights were alive with sound. He imagined whispers threading through the walls, weaving into the city beyond, carrying pieces of him into the world he had built. He knew his body was trapped, but his presence wasn't. The streets still spoke his name. The prison still hummed with his shadow. And so, with every whisper, the myth of Lucky Luciano grew larger than the man himself. To some, he was a prisoner fading into obscurity. To others, he was a ghost still haunting the alleys of New York, a voice carried on whispers too quiet to be silenced. And in the end, that was enough. For in a world where truth and rumor blurred into one, power belonged not to the loudest man in the room, but to the one whose silence made others whisper his name. In prison, daylight belonged to the guards. But the night belonged to the men inside. When the corridors dimmed, when footsteps grew fewer, that was when the real business began. Deals weren't made in broad daylight with watchful eyes peering down from towers. They were made in the shadows, behind whispers, in the quiet corners where the law's gaze never seemed to reach. Lucky Luciano understood this better than anyone. Even caged, even locked within Sing Sing's towering walls, he knew that business never truly stopped. The streets outside didn't wait for his release. Empires didn't pause just because their king was behind bars. And so, he found a way to make the prison itself another board on which the game could be played. It started small, a cigarette slid across a table during chow. A piece of bread traded for a stick of contraband tobacco. The men inside always had their economies, little black markets that made prison life bearable. But when Lucky's steady hand touched those markets, they grew. Cigarettes became favors. Favors became debts. And debts became leverage. He knew the value of patience. He didn't demand loyalty outright. Instead, he let the deals unfold naturally, as though they were the ideas of the men who sought him out. A guard who needed quick cash for his family, Luciano made sure a few dollars found their way into his pocket through a trusted outside contact. An inmate desperate for protection from another gang, Luciano arranged for him to have a new ally, one who'd suddenly change sides in a hallway scuffle. These weren't random acts of kindness. These were investments, carefully placed like chips on a gambling table. The dark was where the whispers traveled safest. At night, messages slipped from cell to cell, folded into scraps of paper, hidden in shoes, tucked into food trays, or passed through laundry bins. Lucky was always at the center, though never directly. He orchestrated through layers, ensuring nothing ever traced back to him cleanly. By the time a deal reached its conclusion, there were so many hands on it that no one could point to its origin. And what were these deals? They weren't petty trades. They were building blocks of empire. Luciano made arrangements that stretched beyond the prison yard. He negotiated territory disputes through coded messages, ensuring rival gangs on the outside didn't erupt into wars that would draw unwanted heat. He approved new ventures, gambling dens, smuggling routes, protection rackets, all with nothing more than a few carefully placed words in the dark. Inside, his power grew in quieter, subtler ways. Food found its way to his plate fresher than what most men received. Guards didn't search his cell with quite the same eagerness they searched others. A man who crossed him found himself mysteriously reassigned to another block or sent to solitary on trumped-up charges. It wasn't loud violence. It wasn't showy. It was the kind of control that made other men lower their voices when he passed by. But not all deals were smooth. There were betrayals too, men who tried to play both sides, to take from Lucky's network without giving back. And in the dark, betrayals were punished just as quietly as the deals were made. A man who'd been loud about his intentions one week would suddenly fall silent the next, shipped off to another prison or transferred to a distant wing where no one ever saw him again. The message was clear: deals with Lucky were honored in silence, and silence was sacred. On the outside, the effect of these dark dealings was felt most in the streets. Numbers games that had been faltering suddenly steadied. Rivalries that might have exploded into bloodshed instead cooled into cautious truces. Even law enforcement noticed it. They wondered aloud how a man locked in Sing Sing could still command the ebb and flow of New York's underworld. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others whispered that Luciano's shadow was longer than any prison wall. Among his closest confidants, men like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, the dark deals became lifelines. They received his coded messages with precision, reading meaning in every pause, every word that seemed too ordinary to be innocent. They carried out his will without question because they knew his vision extended farther than theirs. They didn't just see him as a leader, they saw him as the architect of a machine too intricate for anyone else to understand. There were moments, though, when the darkness pressed in. When the cell grew too small, the walls too close, and Luciano wondered how long this game could last. Power through whispers, power through shadows, it was enough for now. But for how long? Would the world remember him if he remained a ghost, or would it need his presence in the flesh? These thoughts came late, in the hours when the prison was at its stillest. He let them sit with him, heavy but never crippling, because doubt was the one deal he could never afford to make. And so, night after night, the dark became his office. The clink of distant chains became his metronome. The shuffle of cards in the cell blocks, the low hum of men gambling on scraps of food or smokes, these were the sounds of his kingdom now. In those sounds, Luciano found rhythm, found opportunity, found continuity. The men around him felt it too. They began to say it in hushed tones, asterisk even in the dark, Lucky's in charge. Asterisk it was less a statement of fact than an acknowledgement of inevitability. Darkness, after all, only hid what the eye could not see. But it never silenced the man who knew how to turn shadows into power. By the time the first light of morning crept through the narrow windows, the deals of the night were already sealed. Men woke with new alliances, new debts, new loyalties. And though the prison guards thought themselves in control, the truth was written in silence, written in the way men deferred to Luciano, in the way order seemed to orbit around his quiet authority. Day belonged to the system. But the night belonged to Lucky. And in those hours when the world was darkest, he reminded everyone that power wasn't about being seen. It was about being felt, like a hand moving the pieces on a board that no one else could even see. Loyalty inside those prison walls was a currency more precious than cigarettes, sharper than blades, and deadlier than any contraband weapon smuggled past the guards. In Sing Sing, where every man wore the same gray uniform and every step echoed in iron corridors, the question wasn't just who you were, it was who you stood with when the lights dimmed and the whispers grew cold. For Lucky Luciano, loyalty had never been a word, it was the foundation of his life, the very code that separated the bosses from the pawns, the living from the forgotten. He had built his empire on the outside not through brute strength, but through alliances. He didn't need to swing a fist when a dozen men were willing to do it for him. He didn't need to raise his voice when his silence alone could bend a room. That power came from loyalty, and inside Sing Sing, he would test whether the same principles still held. At first, it was subtle. The other inmates, especially the Italian men who knew his reputation, offered nods of respect when he passed. Some tried to attach themselves too eagerly, hoping proximity to Luciano would offer them protection. He accepted no one outright. To Lucky, loyalty wasn't declared, it was proven. And proof in prison often came at a cost. The first test arrived when a fight broke out in the yard. Two rival groups, Irish and Italian inmates, collided over something as small as gambling debts. It escalated fast, fists swinging, shouts tearing through the cold air. Guards charged in with batons, but before they could even break it up, Lucky noticed the eyes watching him. His own men, young Italians who claimed to serve him, looked his way, waiting for a signal. It was a dangerous moment. If he stepped in too openly, the guards would see him as a ringleader. If he held back, his men might doubt his strength. So he did what he always did, he played it smart. He gave no shout, no dramatic gesture. Just the smallest tilt of his head toward one man in the scuffle. That was all it took. His loyalist threw himself into the fray, dragging an ally out before the guards slammed their batons down. By the time the dust settled, Lucky had given nothing away, yet the message was clear: he didn't need to shout to command loyalty. His men understood even the smallest sign. Word of that spread. "You don't gotta hear him to know what he wants," one inmate whispered. Lucky talks without talkin'. That kind of reputation was gold. In a place where alliances could turn bloody in an instant, to have a leader who could command silently, almost invisibly, meant safety, meant direction. But loyalty came with weight, the weight of expectation. Men expected Lucky to look after them, to keep them fed, to keep them safe. They wanted his shadow to shield them from rival gangs, from guards with cruel streaks, from the endless grind of prison life. And while Luciano thrived on that power, he also felt the burden of it pressing harder than the iron bars. At night, when he lay in his bunk staring at the faint strip of moonlight cutting across the wall, he thought of the men outside: Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel, friends who had always placed their faith in him. They were carrying the weight of the empire now. Did they resent him for being locked away? Or were they proving their loyalty in the way he had always trusted they would? These questions lingered like smoke in the corners of his mind. His reflections grew darker when he considered the betrayals that had led to his imprisonment. He thought of Thomas Dewey, the relentless prosecutor who had made it his mission to put him behind bars. But deeper than that, he thought of the witnesses, the ones who had once bowed to him in nightclubs and whispered deals in backrooms, only to stand tall in courtrooms when the state promised them safety. Where was their loyalty when he needed it? To Lucky, betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back, it was an erasure of everything he stood for. It made loyalty shine brighter, but it also made the loss of it cut deeper. And yet, in Sing Sing, there were men who would have died for him. They weren't glamorous mobsters or polished businessmen. They were hardened cons, thieves, and hustlers, drawn to him because he represented something bigger than their sentences. To follow Lucky was to believe in a world where respect was earned, where betrayal was punished, and where even behind bars you could belong to something greater than yourself. One night in the mess hall, a guard deliberately spilled a tray over one of Luciano's men, a young Italian kid serving time for robbery. The guard sneered, daring the inmate to react. The kid froze, torn between anger and fear. Lucky didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes met the boy's, a calm, steady gaze that said more than words ever could: "Don't take the bait. I'll handle it." The boy lowered his head, swallowed his rage, and walked away. Hours later, that guard found himself reassigned to a different block, no explanation given. Lucky had spoken in silence, and once again, loyalty deepened. Still, it wasn't without cost. For every man who proved loyal, there was another who tried to use his name, to claim his blessing without earning it. Those men became liabilities. And Lucky, even behind bars, dealt with liabilities decisively. A few words whispered in the yard, a card game that ended in sudden violence, a transfer arranged through quiet strings pulled, betrayal never lingered long around him. The weight of loyalty wasn't just about maintaining allies. It was about reminding everyone of the consequences of disloyalty. Loyalty kept men alive. Disloyalty erased them from the board. But Luciano wasn't blind to the toll it took. Some nights, as the prison slept, he admitted to himself that he longed for freedom not just to reclaim power, but to shed the constant burden of it. To sit in a bar again, to laugh with his friends without wondering who was watching, who was listening, who was calculating the exact moment to turn against him. Loyalty, he realized, was both armor and chain. It protected him, but it bound him too. As weeks turned into months and months edged closer to years, the weight grew heavier. His men relied on him as much as they ever had. Outside, his empire still looked to him for direction. And yet he wondered, was loyalty eternal? Or was it just another deal, one that expired when power shifted hands? The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man locked in a cage, yet still commanding more loyalty than politicians on the outside, than businessmen in tailored suits. Men followed him not because they had to, but because they believed he could still deliver even from behind walls. It was proof of his genius, of his influence. But it was also a reminder that loyalty was fragile, always needing to be fed, always needing to be reinforced. The night closed in, the iron bars casting long shadows across his cell. Lucky exhaled slowly, the weight of loyalty pressing heavy on his chest. He would carry it as he always had. Because in his world, loyalty wasn't a choice. It was survival. And for Lucky Luciano, survival was the only game that mattered, whether on the streets of New York or in the silent, shadowed halls of Sing Sing. Power is a strange thing inside prison walls. Out in the free world, it's measured in cars, in cash, in suits tailored by the best hands in the city. But inside Sing Sing, power strips itself down to the essentials. Who gets food? Who gets protection? Who gets a cigarette when they're shaking with need? Who can walk across the yard without looking over their shoulder? Inside those walls, the rules of power were reduced, but they were also amplified. Every decision mattered. Every small advantage meant life or death. For Lucky Luciano, this was not new ground. He had always believed that power wasn't about muscles or guns. It was about influence. It was about knowing which man could be touched with fear, which one could be swayed by kindness, which one needed a favor, and which one needed a lesson. That understanding had made him the most formidable mobster in America before prison. Now, behind iron gates, he had to prove that power could be carried into a cage and still grow. At first, the guards thought locking him away had stripped him of everything. They believed a prison uniform would reduce him to just another number, just another body on the roster. But Sing Sing quickly learned that Luciano wasn't a man you contained, he was a man you negotiated with, even if you pretended not to. It started small. A favor here, a whisper there. Inmates began approaching him with problems, debts that couldn't be paid, rivalries that had spiraled too far, food stolen in the mess hall, insults that demanded blood. Each time, Luciano handled it with a quiet efficiency. Sometimes with words, sometimes with gestures, and sometimes with the invisible hand of fear. Within weeks, he wasn't just another prisoner, he was the arbiter of disputes. He was the quiet judge, the man whose approval or disapproval could change your fate inside those walls. The guards noticed, of course. They always noticed. Some of them hated it, furious that their authority was being undermined. Others, though, leaned into it. Because even guards had their weaknesses. Some drank. Some gambled. Some owed debts to men on the outside. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He had always known that power didn't stop at the prison gates, it seeped through, carried by the very men who believed themselves untouchable. Soon, a guard here and there began looking the other way. Another guard made sure Luciano got an extra portion at dinner. Another arranged a work detail that allowed him freedom to walk across the yard when others were locked down. This wasn't charity. This was business. And in Sing Sing, Lucky rebuilt what he had always been best at, an invisible empire. Other inmates had tried before him. Gang leaders, tough men, ambitious hustlers. But their power had always been raw, messy, fragile. They relied on violence alone. Luciano was different. He didn't need to swing a shank to prove his strength. He didn't need to scream to command respect. His power came from the fact that others, whether inmate or guard, chose to align with him because it made their lives easier, smoother, safer. One of the most telling examples came during a cold winter morning when the entire cell block was restless. Supplies were running thin, food portions smaller than usual. Tension sparked in the air, men whispering about starting trouble. Lucky could feel it, the way a storm builds on the horizon. He knew that if a riot broke out, the guards would crack down mercilessly, and everyone would suffer, including him. So he acted first. Through subtle signals, he sent word to both Italian and Irish crews to meet in the laundry room under the pretense of work duty. It was risky, two groups that barely tolerated each other stuffed into one overheated room. But Luciano spoke to them the way he always had, calm, measured, logical. You start trouble, the guards win, he told them. They'll lock us down, starve us worse, beat a few of you half dead, for example. What do you get out of that? Nothing. You wait. You bide your time. And when the chance comes to make things better, you make it count. Not before. The men listened. Not because they trusted each other, but because they trusted him. By the time the guards expected chaos, the yard was calm. Luciano had turned fire into silence. And with that silence, his reputation doubled. He wasn't just a boss, he was the man who could keep the whole prison from burning down. That kind of power wasn't given by fists, it was given by minds. But power also brought enemies. There were always men who couldn't stomach another man's influence. A rival inmate, a brutal figure with a reputation for violence, decided to challenge Luciano. He spread whispers that Lucky wasn't really in control, that he was just an old gangster living off past glory. For days, the tension simmered. Everyone waited for Luciano to respond. When the confrontation came, it was in the yard. The rival approached him, loud, aggressive, trying to draw him into a fight. Dozens of eyes watched. This was a test, not of Luciano's fists, but of his ability to maintain control under pressure. Luciano didn't raise his voice. He didn't even stand. He just leaned back slightly, his eyes locked on the man, and spoke in a low tone. You want to be me? You think this is about who can bleed more in the dirt? You'll be forgotten by nightfall. I'll still be here tomorrow, and the day after that. The day you're not. Then he gave a subtle nod. Within seconds, half a dozen inmates, men the rival didn't even realize were loyal to Luciano, stood between them. Not threatening. Just standing. Silent walls of flesh. The rival's bravado drained. He realized the truth in that moment. Luciano's power didn't come from his own fists. It came from the willingness of others to rise for him. That was the kind of power you couldn't fight because it wasn't in one man. It was in the air itself. The rival backed down. No violence was needed. And that too became legend. In Sing Sing, where knives flashed and blood spilled every week, Luciano had won a war without lifting a finger. But even as his influence spread, Luciano knew power inside prison was a double-edged blade. Every alliance had to be tended, every whisper managed, every favor tracked. It was exhausting. Yet he thrived on it because it reminded him that even stripped of his wealth, his suits, his cars, he was still Lucky Luciano, the man who could bend a world, even if that world was no larger than a prison block. He reflected often on the irony. Outside, he had controlled entire industries: gambling, nightclubs, unions, docks. Inside, his empire was smaller: the food line, the yard, the contraband market. But the principles were the same. Influence was influence, no matter how small the kingdom. And in mastering this small kingdom, he proved to himself and to everyone watching that his power wasn't an illusion of freedom. It was inside him. It was who he was. Perhaps the most telling moment came when a new warden arrived at Sing Sing. Unlike his predecessor, this man was sharp, ambitious, determined to stamp out corruption. He made a show of cracking down on smuggling, of rotating guards, of imposing stricter schedules. Many inmates trembled. Some whispered that Luciano's influence would crumble. But the opposite happened. Within weeks, the new warden found himself facing fewer riots, fewer fights, a calmer prison than before. And though he never admitted it out loud, he knew why Luciano was keeping the peace. Luciano was the balance between chaos and control. The warden didn't like it, but he accepted it. And so, even the administration, those meant to strip him of power, fell into the quiet gravity of his influence. Power behind bars was not about dominance. It was about endurance. It was about patience. It was about understanding that in a place where everyone wanted something, the man who could give or deny those wants became king. Lucky Luciano was that king. Not by force, not by wealth, but by the same invisible force he had always wielded: respect, fear, and loyalty bound together in silence. And so, Sing Sing became not a cage for Luciano, but another throne. The walls did not diminish him. They defined him in sharper relief. Inside those cold corridors, he proved what he had always known: true power is not where you stand, but how the world bends when you move. Betrayal always cuts deeper than violence. A knife in the ribs, a fist across the jaw, those things heal. But betrayal? That lives under the skin, poisoning every thought, every memory. For Lucky Luciano, who had built his empire on loyalty, on oaths sworn in backrooms and sealed with blood, betrayal was the one wound he could never allow himself to forget. It had started before prison, in the streets of New York, when whispers crept into corners he thought he owned. Betrayal rarely comes from strangers, it comes from men who shared your bread, your secrets, your dreams. And for Luciano, those shadows began to gather when rivals realized they could not break him by force. So they turned to daggers in the dark. Inside Sing Sing, those same shadows followed him. He had allies, yes, men who bent to his words, guards who looked the other way. But in every alliance, there was a crack. In every smile, there was the chance of a lie. That was the cost of power. The higher you stood, the more men dreamed of pulling you down. One night, in the dim silence of the cell block, he overheard a fragment of a conversation, two inmates speaking low, too low for casual talk. They were discussing shipments, money, and names he knew belonged to him. Luciano didn't move, didn't let his breath change. He simply listened, absorbing every syllable. The betrayal was clear: someone was leaking his lines of communication with the outside, feeding them to enemies who still hungered for his throne. In prison, betrayal was not just dangerous. It was lethal. A single whisper to the wrong man could mean a shank in the yard, a poison cup, or a setup with guards who wanted an excuse to crush you. Luciano understood this well. And so, he began to watch. For weeks, he studied the movements of the men around him. Who lingered too long after meals? Who exchanged folded notes too quickly? Who received visits that didn't fit the patterns of family or lawyers? Slowly, the net of suspicion narrowed. And when he found the man at its center, his heart burned with a cold fire. It wasn't an outsider. It wasn't a rival gang member. It was someone he had once lifted, someone whose debts he had cleared, someone who had eaten at his table. That was the cruel nature of betrayal: it always came dressed as trust. Luciano didn't strike immediately. That wasn't his way. Rage might tempt a man to lash out, but Luciano's power had always been patience. He let the betrayal continue, let the man grow comfortable, careless. Because he knew the longer the shadow stretched, the clearer its source became. Meanwhile, the prison itself seemed to conspire against him. Guards had begun tightening searches, finding contraband more easily than before. His communications with allies outside grew thinner, choked by interference. At first, it seemed like bad luck. But Luciano didn't believe in luck, not when it came to survival. He believed in causes, in actions, in enemies who moved unseen. Someone inside was feeding information out. And someone outside was using it to choke his empire. This realization forced him to reflect. Power had given him everything: money, women, cars, respect. But it had also painted a target on his back that never faded. And now, even in prison, stripped of the world he once commanded, men still wanted to destroy him. Why? Because betrayal isn't about survival. It's about envy. It's about the deep hunger in small men to see great men fall. The decisive moment came in the yard under a gray sky heavy with snow. Luciano had arranged for his betrayer to walk beside him, casual as though nothing was wrong. Around them, his loyal men fanned out quietly, blending into the crowd. To anyone else, it was just another afternoon. But to the man beside him, it was the last walk he would ever take without fear. Luciano didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply asked one question, his eyes locked on the man's. Why? The betrayer stammered, denied, tried to twist words. But Luciano saw through it. The sweat, the trembling hands, the darting eyes, they were all confessions louder than words. And in that silence, surrounded by men who owed their lives to him, the betrayer knew he had no escape. What happened next was not loud. It wasn't dramatic. Luciano believed that betrayal deserved no spectacle, it deserved erasure. The man was gone before the yard cleared, a shadow swallowed by a darker shadow. No guard saw. No inmate spoke. Fear sealed every mouth. In Sing Sing, silence was currency, and Luciano had more of it than anyone. Yet even in victory, betrayal left its scar. Alone in his cell that night, Luciano thought about all the men he had trusted over the years. Men who had sworn loyalty only to sell it cheap when temptation knocked. Was betrayal inevitable? Was loyalty just a mask men wore until they found a better offer? He didn't know. But he did know one truth: betrayal only made him sharper. Each wound hardened him. Each shadow taught him where to shine his light. Outside the prison walls, betrayal was also shaping his empire. Rivals took advantage of his absence, cutting deals, carving territories. Some of his closest lieutenants grew restless, whispering about whether Luciano's reign was truly over. Even allies began to drift, their loyalty tested by opportunity. But what those men failed to understand was this: Luciano's empire had never been built on his physical presence. It had been built on systems, on networks, on respect that ran deeper than fear. He had created a structure that could bend but not break, even when shadows tried to pull it apart. And when whispers of betrayal reached him through coded letters and smuggled words, he responded the only way he knew how: by reminding everyone, inside and outside, that lucky Luciano was still watching. Sometimes reminders came as gifts. A rival who pushed too far found his business raided by unknown hands. A lieutenant who grew too ambitious saw his family suddenly protected by men he didn't control. These weren't random acts. They were messages, carefully designed to say, even behind bars, my reach touches you. That was the paradox of betrayal. It threatened him, yes, but it also gave him opportunity. Each act of treachery revealed weakness, exposed cracks. And for a man like Luciano, cracks weren't just dangers, they were openings. In the quiet hours of the night, when the prison hummed with the low moans of sleeping men, he often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every betrayal he had ever faced. The old ones from the streets. The fresh ones from the prison. They haunted him, yes, but they also sharpened him. Because in the end, betrayal was the crucible of power. It burned away illusions, leaving only what was real. And what was real was this: no matter how many men betrayed him, no matter how many shadows gathered, lucky Luciano endured. He always endured. Because betrayal could wound him, but it could never unmake him. For power is not destroyed by betrayal. It is tested by it. And every time the shadows moved against him, Luciano proved that he was more than a man. He was an institution, a presence, a force that no prison bars, no rival lies, no traitor's whisper could erase. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually bends beneath the weight of time. For lucky Luciano, the man who once ruled the underworld with invisible strings, the fall did not come as a thunderclap. It came as a slow erosion, and empire chipped away piece by piece until the crown grew too heavy to hold. The world outside Sing Sing was no longer the same city he had once commanded. When Luciano was first caged, the streets whispered his name with fear and reverence. But years passed, and in those years, new men rose. Names like Genovese, Costello, and Anastasia began to carve their own legends. They weren't replacements for Luciano, they were branches from the tree he had planted. But branches can grow wild, sometimes strangling the roots that birthed them. By the time the war years came, Luciano's power had shifted into something different. The government, desperate to protect the docks and the flow of supplies, turned to him. It was ironic, almost poetic, the state that once branded him as a menace now quietly bargained for his influence. His empire, his network of loyalty and fear, became a weapon in the hands of America itself. Through secret channels, his men safeguarded ports, kept saboteurs at bay, and ensured that warships sailed without interference. But the government's embrace was not salvation. It was a transaction. And transactions always end. When the war closed, Luciano was granted freedom, but it was not true freedom. They exiled him, sending him back to Italy, a land he had not called home since childhood. To the world, it was mercy. To Luciano, it was exile. The streets of New York, the heartbeat of his empire, were no longer his to walk. He had traded the concrete of Manhattan for the marble of Naples, but marble does not echo with footsteps of loyalty. In Italy, he lived like a shadow of himself. Men still respected his name, but respect carried less weight when it was spoken in whispers rather than shouted in fear. He tried to rebuild, to weave his influence into the black markets of post-war Europe, but it was never the same. America had been his canvas, his masterpiece. Italy was just an echo. Yet even in decline, Luciano remained a figure larger than life. Visitors came often, men from the old world, emissaries from the new. They came seeking counsel, validation, or simply to sit in the presence of the man who had once designed the commission, the architect of modern organized crime. He was no longer the king, but he was the ghost of the king, and ghosts have power of their own. But ghosts also live with regrets. Alone in quiet villas, Luciano often reflected on the path that had led him there. He thought of the betrayals, the wars, the choices made in smoke-filled rooms. He thought of friends buried too young, of enemies who had outlived their hate. And perhaps, in the deepest silence, he thought of the boy he once was, the immigrant child running through New York streets, hungry and unnoticed, who only wanted to be somebody. That boy had gotten his wish, but at a price he could never repay. Luciano's fall was not dramatic. There were no assassins waiting in alleys, no bloody wars that carried him away. His fall was quieter, more human. On a cold January evening in 1962, in Naples, his heart finally gave way. A man who had survived bullets, knives, betrayals, and prisons was undone by the most ordinary enemy, time. The news spread like wildfire. In America, in Sicily, in Havana, men paused when they heard. Some lowered their heads in respect. Some smirked, glad to know the legend was finally gone. But all of them, friend, foe, and stranger alike, felt the weight of the moment. Because Luciano was not just a man. He was an era. His funeral in Naples drew hundreds. Men in dark suits lined the streets, their faces masks of grief and calculation. Some came to honor him, others to be seen, still others to ensure that his shadow would not linger too long over their own ambitions. In death as in life, Luciano remained a stage upon which others performed. But legacy is not measured by the ceremony of funerals. Legacy is measured by what survives after the body is gone. And in this, Luciano's shadow proved eternal. The commission he had founded endured, shaping organized crime for decades. The rules he had enforced, the codes of silence, the division of territories, the system of checks and balances, became the spine of the underworld. Even rivals who had once plotted his downfall unknowingly followed the blueprint he had drawn. Historians would later debate him. Was he a criminal mastermind or a brilliant strategist trapped in the wrong world? Was he a villain who corrupted cities or a visionary who imposed order on chaos? The answers were never clear, because Luciano himself had always been both things at once. A builder and a destroyer. A king and a prisoner. A man and a myth. Perhaps that was his greatest legacy, not the power he wielded, but the contradictions he embodied. For in Luciano's story, the world saw the timeless truth of ambition, that greatness and ruin often walk hand in hand, and that the higher one climbs, the darker the fall becomes. And so, long after his body was laid to rest, lucky Luciano lived on. In the whispers of gangsters plotting their next move. In the books of scholars trying to understand the architecture of power. In the imaginations of storytellers who found in him a figure larger than the world that tried to contain him. The fall had come. But the legacy remained. And perhaps that is the truest measure of power, not how brightly one shines in life, but how long the glow lingers after death. Power has a way of outliving the man who first holds it. Long after lucky Luciano had been forced from New York, after his body weakened and his empire fractured, his influence lingered like cigarette smoke in a closed room. You could not see him on the corner of Mulberry Street anymore, but his rules, his lessons, his blueprint for organized crime remained etched into the bones of the city. He was gone in flesh, but his ghost still dictated the rhythm of the underworld. For those who had risen under him, Costello, Genovese, Lansky, the name Lucky was more than memory. It was a compass. Each one of them measured their steps against the empire he had once commanded. To betray his lessons was to gamble with survival itself. To follow them was to ensure that the streets did not collapse into chaos. His ghost was discipline, and discipline was the one thing even the law could never fully enforce. In America, newspapers painted him as a fading legend. They spoke of him as though he had been swallowed by the past, a relic of the roaring 20s and bloody 30s. But inside the quiet backrooms of clubs, in whispered meetings where smoke coiled under the low lights, Luciano's presence was alive. Men still invoked his name like scripture. Would Lucky have approved? They asked before moving shipments, before striking deals, before taking vengeance. His absence had not left a vacuum. It had created a mythology. And mythology is sometimes more powerful than the man himself. Even in Naples, he could feel it. Letters arrived. Men traveled oceans to see him. Young lieutenants kissed his hand as if they were bowing before royalty. But behind the loyalty was something deeper, a hunger to touch the source, to say they had stood in the shadow of the man who had once designed the very machine that made them rich. Luciano was not merely alive in Naples, he was a relic to be studied, a ghost walking in daylight. But ghosts cannot escape mirrors. At night, when silence pressed heavy against the windows, Luciano often confronted his own reflection. His eyes, once sharp enough to cut through a man's lies, now carried the weight of decades. He could not hide from the truth that his ghost of power had become stronger than the man himself. He was revered, but he was also forgotten. Revered in legend, forgotten in reality. His body was frail, his lungs weakened, his reach limited. He could feel time mocking him, reminding him that every king eventually becomes just a man with memories. And yet, he clung to what he had built. He replayed the old days in his mind, the smoky poker tables, the clink of glasses in backroom speakeasies, the sudden crack of gunfire in the night. He remembered the faces of men who had pledged loyalty and men who had betrayed it. He remembered how it felt to walk into a room and know that every conversation paused, every eye shifted, every decision bent to his will. That kind of power is intoxicating, and even in exile, he refused to let go of its taste. But ghosts are not just whispers of glory, they are also chains of regret. In his solitude, Luciano could not always silence the questions. Was it worth it? Had the betrayals, the bloodshed, the years behind bars carved anything lasting, or had he simply been another man chasing shadows? Did his so-called commission bring order, or did it merely polish the chaos into something shinier, deadlier, more enduring? For every rule he had created, there was another grave filled by its consequence. For every dollar earned, there was another son left fatherless, another mother left weeping in a tenement hallway. He knew these truths, but like all men who build empires, he learned to carry them in silence. Still, his ghost lingered. Even the law could not erase him. FBI files carried his name well into the 1950s and 1960s, as if the agents themselves could not admit he was truly gone. Politicians debated whether his deportation had truly ended his influence, or whether it had only exported the American disease of organized crime to Europe. In whispers across Havana and Sicily, his legend flared anew. He had become untouchable not because he was invincible, but because even in exile, his story was too large to bury. For the younger generation of gangsters, he was both a model and a warning. Some idolized his cunning, the way he stitched chaos into structure, the way he had stared down bosses and remade the rules of the game. Others saw only the cost: exile, loneliness, a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. In their own ruthless rise, they wondered if they would end up the same, powerful but displaced, feared but forgotten. Luciano's ghost was not just a presence. It was a prophecy. And perhaps that was the truest tragedy of Lucky Luciano's prison years in exile. He had built something that no man could kill, not even the government, not even death itself. But in building it, he had lost the one thing every gangster secretly longs for: not riches, not fear, not loyalty. Peace. His ghost lived because the machine he had designed could not die. But he himself, the man beneath the legend, would never escape it. There comes a point in every man's life when the noise he once commanded fades into silence. For Lucky Luciano, that silence was not sudden, it crept in slowly, like fog rolling through the streets of a city he no longer walked. In Naples, far from the glittering skyline of Manhattan, the silence pressed against him like a second skin. He had once been the orchestrator of chaos, the man who could pick up a phone and set entire neighborhoods trembling. Now, the only ringing he heard was his own heartbeat, steady but weakening, reminding him that time had claimed more soldiers than any gun ever could. He knew he was nearing the end. His body betrayed him daily: sharp pains in the chest, moments of breathlessness, the unsteady tremble in his hands when he reached for a cigarette. The doctors told him to quit, but Luciano had never been a man to surrender to advice. He had surrendered only to necessity. And so, he smoked and he drank and he stared at the Mediterranean horizon as though the waves might bring back a piece of the life he had lost. But even in this silence, his ghost of power was never far. Men still came to see him: old associates who owed him everything, young bloods who wanted his blessing. They treated him like a king in exile, bowing their heads, speaking with reverence. Yet Luciano could see in their eyes something he could not ignore: the hunger of men who had outgrown their teacher. They wanted his approval, yes, but more than that, they wanted his seat. It was the eternal cycle of power, one he had once manipulated himself. Now he was on the other side of it, an old man watching younger wolves sharpen their teeth. He would sit with them in cafes, sip espresso, and let them talk. They spoke of shipments, of politics, of alliances stretching from Sicily to New York. Luciano listened but rarely intervened. His mind was sharp, but his voice carried less weight than it once had. He realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than any betrayal, that he was no longer the center of the world he had built. He was its ghost, tolerated, respected, but no longer obeyed. And yet, he found strange comfort in that. For the first time in decades, he was not fighting, not plotting, not calculating every move. The prison years had stripped him, exile had humbled him, and now silence offered something he had never known: reflection. He could finally admit the truths he had buried beneath ambition. He thought of the friends who had fallen: Dutch Schultz, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia. Men who had lived fast, died violently, and left nothing behind but stories. Luciano had outlived them all, but survival was its own kind of prison. He had been forced to watch the empire change, to see the faces of the next generation take over the stage he had built. Survival, he realized, was not always victory. Sometimes it was punishment. Still, he could not fully escape the game. Even in exile, whispers reached him of government agencies that still tracked his movements, of plots that circled his name. The Americans had not forgotten him, and perhaps they never would. They feared that even in silence, he might pull one last string, make one last move. And in truth, the thought tempted him. He was lucky Luciano, after all. To die quietly felt almost unnatural. But fate had its own plans. On January 26, 1962, Luciano walked into Naples' Capodichino airport to meet with a producer who wanted to make a film about his life. For Luciano, it was one last deal, his story told on screen, cemented in history not by whispers but by film reels. He was calm, almost serene, as though he understood that this meeting was not about business. It was about closure. As he waited, cigarette in hand, his heart betrayed him. A sharp pain tore through his chest, and within moments Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, the man who had once controlled New York like a maestro, collapsed onto the airport floor. The silence he had lived with finally claimed him. News spread quickly. In America, headlines screamed his death, painting him once again as the notorious kingpin, the deported gangster, the man who had outwitted law enforcement for decades. In Naples, crowds gathered to mourn him not just as a criminal, but as a figure of legend, a man who had defied fate longer than anyone thought possible. And in the underworld, his name echoed like a closing bell. The ghost of Lucky Luciano had finally been laid to rest. But his rules, his commission, his vision, they lived on, stronger than flesh, sharper than memory. Even in death, Luciano had the final word. His funeral in Naples drew thousands, and though the American government refused to allow his body to return to New York, Luciano's legend crossed oceans. He had left the world the way he had lived in it, on his own terms, at the center of a stage he had built himself. For those who followed, his life was both a map and a warning. Power could be taken, built, structured, but it could never be tamed. Luciano's silence was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the myth. And so, as the years stretched on, his ghost continued to haunt the very streets he once ruled. In the neon glow of New York, in the smoke-filled cafes of Naples, in the whispered deals of Havana and Sicily, the legend of Lucky Luciano remained. The man was gone. The silence had claimed him. But the story, his story, was louder than ever. Because silence, when it belongs to a man like Luciano, is never truly silence. It is an echo that refuses to die. Lucky Luciano was dead, but his story had only begun its afterlife. In the smoke-filled backrooms of New York, in the docks of Sicily, in the neon casinos of Havana, his name lingered like the scent of expensive cologne long after the man wearing it had left the room. To the underworld, he was not merely a memory, he was a blueprint. His commission, the structure he had designed with such cold precision, continued to dictate the rhythm of organized crime for decades. Even when his body had returned to dust beneath Italian soil, the rules he had written remained engraved in the hearts of men who had never even met him. In America, prosecutors and lawmen found themselves chasing ghosts. The commission was no longer one man's empire but a hydra with many heads, each one whispering in the shadows. It was Luciano's gift and his curse to the world. He had made the mafia not a gang of reckless thugs but a corporation. It was too organized to kill, too vast to contain. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who had once arrogantly dismissed the mafia as a myth, was forced in the years after Luciano's death to acknowledge its iron grip. But by then, the structure was far too deep, too widespread. Luciano's silence had become an echo chamber filled with voices that carried his design into eternity. In Sicily, his ghost was revered with a different tone. To the men of the old country, he was proof that one of their own could cross the ocean and bend America to his will. His exile in Naples had cemented his status as a living legend. The young mafiosi who came to sit with him in cafes during his final years told stories after his death, stories that grew taller with each telling. Luciano, they said, was not just a man, he was a force of destiny. His name was spoken with the kind of respect usually reserved for saints or conquerors. But his sainthood was written in blood, and his conquest was carved into the bones of cities. In Havana, where he had once dreamed of building a paradise of casinos and deals, his shadow still lingered long after Batista fell and Fidel Castro's revolution stripped the city of its neon glamour. Tourists in later years would wander the crumbling halls of old hotels and whisper about the nights Luciano had walked there, cigar smoke trailing him like a crown. The revolution had burned his empire, but the memory remained. Havana's ghosts were not only Spanish or colonial, they were also gangsters with slick-back hair and sharp suits. And at the center of those whispers was always Luciano. But perhaps his greatest afterlife was in the culture of America itself. The country that had deported him, stripped him of his citizenship, and branded him a criminal found itself fascinated by his story. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, artists of every kind returned to his life as if it were scripture. The Godfather, though fictional, carried his fingerprints in its pages and frames. The idea of a commission of organized crime, run like a family council, came directly from the world Luciano had built. Audiences were enthralled not by the brutality but by the order he had imposed on chaos. Luciano had taken the gangster, once seen as a street thug, and transformed him into something larger, an institution, a dynasty. Law enforcement, too, could not escape his shadow. The RICO Act, designed decades later to dismantle organized crime, was in many ways a direct response to Luciano's invention of a system bigger than any one man. Prosecutors knew that men like him would always return, if not in flesh, then in form. To fight the mafia was to fight Luciano's ghost, a ghost that refused to die because it was made not of bone but of structure, of strategy, of vision. In New York's Little Italy, old-timers still told stories in hushed voices about the days when Luciano's word was law. Some swore they had seen him walk Mulberry Street, others claimed he had blessed their fathers or spared their uncles. Every neighborhood had its Luciano myth, and though most were fiction, they fed into the legend. The real Luciano might have laughed at their exaggerations, but he would have understood. Legends, after all, were worth more than truth. Even Hollywood could not let him go. Films and TV shows painted him in every shade, some as the ruthless kingpin, others as the reluctant visionary, still others as a tragic figure caught in the machine he himself had built. Actors wore his face, directors mimicked his tone, and audiences sat in the dark watching shadows of Luciano flicker on the screen. His legacy was not just history, it was mythology, constantly rewritten and reborn. But beneath the glamour and the legend, there remained the truth of a man who had been both feared and lonely. Those who knew him in his final years often remarked on the paradox of his existence. Here was a man who had once controlled nations through whispers, now sitting quietly in a cafe, watching life pass by. His power had made him untouchable, but it had also made him solitary. He had no wife, no children to carry his name. His legacy was not in bloodlines but in systems, in rules, in an empire of shadows. And yet, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps Luciano understood in those last quiet days that immortality does not always require family. Sometimes it requires only influence. His silence had become eternal, but his design ensured that he was never absent. Historians still debate him. Was he a criminal genius who brought order to chaos, or a ruthless tyrant who dressed murder in business suits? Was he a patriot who aided America in its hour of need during World War II, or merely a man playing both sides for survival? These questions swirl around his name, but like all great figures, the truth is lost somewhere between the myth and the man. What cannot be denied is this: Lucky Luciano changed the face of the underworld forever. He was not the first gangster, nor the last, But he was the one who turned crime into an empire, who shifted the narrative from violence to structure, from street fights to boardrooms. In that transformation, he ensured that his shadow would stretch far beyond his own lifetime. And so the world moves on, but Luciano remains. His commission, though weakened in later decades, still lingers in whispers. His strategies are studied not only by criminals but by academics, lawmen, and storytellers. His name is invoked in rap lyrics, in novels, in films, in the secret conversations of men who still deal in power beneath the surface of society. Death claimed his body in Naples, but his spirit fused into the machinery of the modern underworld. He became less a man than a system, less flesh than myth. And in that transformation, he achieved what few men ever do: immortality. The streets of New York no longer echo with his footsteps, the cafes of Naples no longer hold his gaze. But the silence he left behind hums with memory. Every deal made in shadow, every council convened in secret, every oath sworn in blood, it all carries a trace of him. Lucky Luciano is gone. But lucky Luciano is everywhere.